The air was heavy with the warmth of the morning sun, spilling its golden light over the courtyard as Jonathan Reed made his way toward the event. It was the 50th anniversary of Clearwater Naval Academy, a place of deep tradition and honor. But despite the grandeur of the occasion, the world seemed oblivious to the elderly man in the crowd, at least at first. Welcome to Heartfelt Gratitude Stories, where we dive into tales of compassion, kindness, and the quiet strength that binds us. So, what really went down that day? Let's find out. "Sir, this seat is reserved for distinguished guests," a young officer said, his voice polite yet firm, with a tone of authority that left no room for argument. Jonathan didn't argue, didn't raise his voice or make a scene. Instead, he simply nodded, a soft acknowledgement, and quietly moved to the back row, where no one would notice him. Isn't that just like him? A quiet man, fading into the background, never seeking the spotlight, but always there when it counted. He had a legacy, a powerful one, but one built on hard work, sacrifice, and the quiet moments that no one ever really notices. It was the 50th anniversary of Clearwater Naval Academy, and the courtyard was alive with excitement. Medals gleamed, proud admirals stood tall in full uniform, and the clicking of cameras filled the air, each shot capturing another moment of history. But amid all the celebratory chaos, there was Jonathan, an old man with a wrinkled shirt and a simple paper bag clutched in his hands. Nobody seemed to notice him. His name on the VIP list seemed like a mistake, an oversight. He didn't fit into the polished picture they had painted that day. No one knew his story, or perhaps they had forgotten it, but it was a story that mattered. A story that would, in time, be told again, in a way that no one expected. It wasn't until the headmaster, a retired four-star admiral, paused mid-speech that the world around him suddenly fell silent. "Is Sergeant Jonathan Reed here today?" he asked, his voice cutting through the air like a thunderclap, shaking the stillness of the courtyard. And in that moment, the air seemed to freeze, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. No one moved, no one dared to speak. Everyone was waiting, as if the question itself carried a weight they hadn't anticipated. And then, just like that, Jonathan's quiet legacy was laid bare before them all. But what really happened that day? What led up to that moment when Jonathan Reed's name was spoken so loudly, so forcefully, in front of a crowd of strangers? Let's rewind the clock a little. The morning had begun crisp and invigorating, the sun casting its warm glow over the stone walls of Clearwater Academy. Flags fluttered along the walkways, swaying with the gentle breeze that seemed to know the importance of the day. Rows of white chairs were arranged meticulously in the courtyard, each one placed with military precision, each seat bearing a name and a purpose. The courtyard itself was a picture of perfection, a testament to the Academy's rich history and the dedication that had built it into the institution it had become. The air hummed with anticipation, as the day's events were about to unfold. Cadets stood at attention, their backs straight, their uniforms spotless. Retired admirals exchanged quiet pleasantries, their conversations steeped in decades of military history. A brass quartet added an air of solemnity to the scene, their music drifting through the air like a whisper of things past. Camera crews adjusted their equipment, making sure not to miss a single moment. Every detail had been checked, polished, and approved, nothing was left to chance. The excitement was palpable. The crowd buzzed with the anticipation that comes right before something truly important begins. And then, from the far edge of the courtyard, a figure appeared, a man moving slowly, but with purpose. He wasn't wearing the traditional uniform that most people would expect. There were no shiny medals, no polished boots, no glistening hats. Instead, Jonathan wore a simple white dress shirt, the sleeves buttoned neatly, the collar pressed just so. Over it, he wore a light tan jacket, practical and unassuming, the kind of jacket worn by men who no longer needed to impress anyone. His khakis, though clean, had a worn look at the cuffs, a sign of years well lived. And his leather shoes, oxblood, the kind that only looked polished under sunlight, shone as though they too carried the weight of history. As he moved forward, there was no entourage following him. No family to accompany him, no assistant, no camera crews to document his every step. In one hand, he carried a folded-up program, one he had printed himself at the local library. In the other, a soft canvas pouch, frayed at the edges, swayed gently as he walked past younger, well-dressed guests arriving in sleek town cars, their uniforms immaculate. His name was Jonathan M. Reed. He was 85 years old, a Marine Corps veteran, and that morning, he had caught the 6 a.m. bus from Cedar Falls, Iowa. The kind of bus that stopped at diners with cracked Formica tables, the kind that served free coffee refills to anyone who was patient enough to wait for them. Jonathan had left his home before dawn, with only one goal in mind, to attend the Academy's 50th anniversary. Not to be celebrated, not to be honored, but simply to witness it, to see what had become of the place he had helped build, to reflect on the legacy he had quietly contributed to. As he neared the front, a young staff member looked up from a clipboard. "Good morning, sir." "Last name Reed?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. The staffer flipped through a few pages, nodded, and smiled. "Yes, Jonathan Reed. You're in the front section, right this way." But then, something subtle happened. A group of junior officers, 3 men and a woman, all younger than 30, turned toward Jonathan as he made his way toward the front row. They were laughing among themselves, deep in conversation about something that had happened at officer candidate school. One of them, a young lieutenant with a buzz cut and piercing blue eyes, noticed Jonathan's approach. "Excuse me, sir," the lieutenant said, his voice polite but firm. "These seats are actually reserved for distinguished guests. The general public is over there." Jonathan paused for a brief moment, glancing down at the printed program in his hand. His name was clearly marked, row 1, seat 3, but he didn't raise the program to show them. He didn't try to explain. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "No problem," before turning and walking back toward the back row, where he found an empty seat. And there, in the last row, Jonathan sat quietly, unnoticed by most, and folded his program neatly in his lap. His hands, steady but faintly trembling, clutched the simple paper bag he had brought with him, the one no one would pay attention to. Inside, there were 3 objects that meant more to him than any medal or plaque ever could: a Marine Corps pin, dulled by time, a green field notebook, worn from years of use, and a letter that he had kept all these years, a reminder of a time when he had given everything to the Academy, without asking for anything in return. As Jonathan sat there, the world seemed to move around him, people talking, cameras flashing, brass instruments tuning, but for Jonathan, none of that mattered. What mattered was the legacy he had helped build, not the one that would be celebrated that day, but the one he had quietly, steadily, and without fanfare contributed to over the years. And then, in the quiet that followed, a cadet, a young man no older than 22, noticed the faded Marine Corps pin on Jonathan's jacket. The cadet, wide-eyed with curiosity and respect, leaned in. "Sir," he said quietly, "are you Marine Corps?" Jonathan, with a small nod, replied, "Retired. A long time ago." The cadet hesitated, then asked, "My father was a gunnery sergeant in Iraq, 2004. He always talked about the old Corps. Did you serve in the Pacific?" Jonathan chuckled softly. "Not quite that far back," he said, his voice low with a memory. "Vietnam, 69. Mostly near Quang Tri." The cadet's expression shifted, a mix of respect and surprise. "That's intense. Were you with 1st Marine Division, 3rd Battalion?" Jonathan smiled gently. "No. 5th Marines. Charlie Company." The cadet leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "Sir, were you part of the founding staff here, at Clearwater Academy?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out the old field notebook. He handed it to the cadet, who opened it carefully. His eyes widened as he read the faded ink, "Introductory Amphibious Assault Concepts, Clearwater Curriculum Draft, Fall 1974. At the bottom, the signature read, Sergeant J.M. You wrote this? The cadet asked, stunned. Jonathan simply nodded. We didn't have much back then. No budget. No structure. We taught from experience, built what we could. The cadet's voice was full of awe. Sir, this is like academy history. Jonathan offered a soft smile. Funny thing about history, he said. Nobody notices when you're making it. You just do the work. Hope someone does it better down the line. The cadet paused, then asked, is it true what they say about General Whitaker? The words hung in the air as the courtyard around them hummed with life, but Jonathan's focus remained on the young cadet. History was a quiet thing, made by people who didn't seek recognition, people like him, people who simply did what needed to be done, because it was the right thing to do. Jonathan turned his eyes back to the stage. You mean, did I pull him out of a blown-up Jeep in the Philippines? Yeah, that happened. The cadet's jaw tightened. And no one here knows. Jonathan shook his head. Most wouldn't believe it anyway. But why? Why didn't you ever tell anyone? The old Marine smiled again. Not bitter, not proud, just still. Because it was never about me. He reached back into the bag and took out the letter, his fingers lingering over the crease before unfolding it. Then he passed it to the cadet, letting him read the typed words aloud in a near whisper. To Sergeant Reed, this academy would not have survived its first year without your guidance. You gave us more than tactics. You gave us standards. Someday I hope I can repay that debt. Respectfully, Lahi Carl A. Whitaker, Clearwater Naval Academy, ONR, 1974. The cadet looked up. He's the headmaster now. Jonathan nodded. I know, and he invited you. Jonathan tapped the folded program on his lap. Got the call myself. He wanted me to sit beside him today, but I didn't wear the right jacket, and I didn't want to correct anyone. The cadet glanced toward the front. That lieutenant, he didn't know. If he had. Jonathan held up a hand, cutting the thought short. It's all right. He's not the story. There was a pause. Wind rustled the banners above. What is? The cadet finally asked. Jonathan looked out over the courtyard, his voice lower now. That we're still here. That this place still trains men and women who serve with honor. That somewhere in those seats is the next instructor who'll give more than he's asked and ask for nothing in return. The young cadet swallowed hard, the weight of what he had just learned settling heavily in his chest. Quietly, he folded the notebook and handed it back to Jonathan, his hands trembling just a bit. You should be on that stage, sir, he said, his voice full of respect and awe. The words hung in the air between them for a moment, before Jonathan took the notebook gently, tucking it back into the pouch. He smiled, just a small, knowing smile that held decades of stories, unspoken truths, and quiet dignity. I was once, just not the way most people expect, he said, his voice low, but full of something deeper. The boy stood up then, his posture straightening, as if the weight of Jonathan's words had reshaped him in that instant. He became more aware of himself, his bearing, as if suddenly understanding that honor wasn't something that could be worn like a uniform, it was something you carried within. Would you mind if I stayed here a while? He asked, his voice softer now, filled with a newfound humility. Jonathan looked at him for a moment, then nodded once, his eyes full of something like approval. Be my guest, he said simply. And together, they sat in silence, watching as the final preparations for the ceremony continued around them. The brass section adjusted their music sheets, their movements precise and practiced. A white-gloved officer passed out speaking notes, ensuring everything was in place. The sun hung high above the stage, casting a bright light that glinted off the polished brass buttons and the sharp epaulets of the officials present. But in the shade of the back row, Jonathan and the cadet shared a moment that didn't need to be broadcast for the world to see. No cameras were capturing this quiet exchange, no microphones amplified their thoughts. Because legacy doesn't always come with microphones. Sometimes, it simply passes quietly from one hand to another, unnoticed by the world, but felt deeply by those who understand. The bell tower struck 11, its deep, resonant tone echoing through the courtyard, signaling the beginning of something important, something that had been years in the making. And just like that, the crowd stood in unison, officers adjusted their hats, cadets came to attention, and the choir, dressed in their navy blazers, began the national anthem. Jonathan Reed, seated at the very back, rose with the others, his hand lifting just above his heart. Not in salute. Not in pride. But in quiet, humble respect. He didn't sing. He never did. But his lips moved with the rhythm of the words, as if he were speaking them to the men and women who had come before him, the ones whose legacy was built in silent sacrifice, far from the spotlight. When the final note of the anthem faded, the master of ceremonies stepped to the podium, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to introduce the headmaster of Clearwater Naval Academy, retired Admiral Carl Whitaker. The applause that followed was not loud or boisterous, it was loud and respectful, the kind of applause that comes from knowing the weight of the moment, not just the rank. Whitaker stepped forward slowly, his back straight, his medals gleaming across his dress uniform. At 73, his voice still carried the same strength it had when he had first steadied young recruits in the open water. But now, as he gripped the edges of the podium, his tone softened, almost reverent. 50 years ago today, he began, his voice steady but full of emotion, this institution opened its doors to an uncertain future. We had no fleet, no buildings, just an idea. And a few men who believed we could build something that mattered. He paused for a moment, allowing the words to settle over the crowd, the truth of them sinking deep. This courtyard used to be gravel. The barracks weren't much more than converted stables. And our instructors, well, some of them didn't even have titles yet. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd, but it wasn't dismissive. It was the laughter of those who knew how far they'd come, who understood what had been sacrificed to make it all possible. Whitaker continued, his voice growing warmer. But what we did have, what kept us going through those long winters and endless drills, was a kind of stubborn loyalty. The kind you can't buy or train into someone. It has to be lived, and it has to be remembered. And then, suddenly, he stopped. The words hung in the air, and the courtyard fell silent. For a long, uncertain moment, Whitaker's eyes scanned the crowd, his gaze deliberate, searching for something, someone. He leaned slightly from the microphone, his voice low but clear. "Is Jonathan Reed here?" he asked. People looked around, confusion flickering on their faces. Officers whispered to each other. Cadets glanced left and right, unsure of what was happening. Whitaker turned back to the podium, his expression thoughtful. "He was supposed to be in the front row," he said, his voice now full of emotion. The silence in the courtyard grew heavier. And then, from the back row, a hand rose, a tentative hand, slowly, almost reverently. A young cadet pointed gently to his left. And there, sitting almost obscured by the canopy of the sound tent, was Jonathan, still seated, still quiet, a figure who had become so accustomed to being overlooked. Whitaker stepped away from the microphone without a word. The crowd held its breath as he descended the stairs and began walking toward Jonathan. The air seemed to change around him. Conversation stopped. Cameras tilted to follow his movements. Officers shifted to allow him through. Cadets stood straighter as he passed. Whitaker reached the last row, and there he was, the same man who, 49 years earlier, had pulled Whitaker's unconscious body from a burning wreckage on a mountainside in the Philippines. The man who had built the first marksmanship course with 2 shovels and a borrowed pickup truck. The man who had written the first training syllabus on a legal pad with a broken pencil. Without hesitation, Whitaker removed his white gloves, tucking them neatly into his belt. Then, without saying a word, he raised his hand and gave Jonathan a full, formal military salute, a perfect 45 degrees, eyes forward, no wavering. The entire courtyard fell silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Jonathan didn't return the salute. He simply stood up, eyes locked with Whitaker's, and extended his hand. The two men shook hands firmly, and Whitaker leaned in, whispering something only Jonathan could hear. Turning back to the crowd, Whitaker's voice rang out, clear and strong. "This man saved my life." Gasps spread through the crowd. It was as if the entire courtyard had collectively exhaled, the weight of the words crashing over them. Whitaker continued, his eyes still on Jonathan. "And more than that, he built the foundation of this academy before any of us had a building to stand in." He turned back to Jonathan. "You've waited long enough." With that, Whitaker gestured toward the stage. A moment later, two officers moved to escort Jonathan down the main aisle. Everyone stepped aside. Some stood at attention. Others bowed their heads. A few cadets, young and still learning what respect truly meant, felt their throats tighten as they watched Jonathan walk forward, side by side with the admiral. Time seemed to fold in on itself. Some saw only an old man, but others began to see the boots that had walked those fields before the roads were paved. They saw the hands that had held a hammer when there was no one else to swing it. They saw the eyes that had watched young men stumble and rise again and again until they became leaders. By the time they reached the stage, the entire courtyard had shifted. No one sat. No one spoke. Whitaker turned to face the microphone but then stopped. He looked at Jonathan, placed a hand on his shoulder, and gently nudged him forward. Jonathan hesitated for just a moment, then stepped up. No speech. No script. He looked out across the sea of polished hats and glinting metals. Then, with a quiet dignity, he looked down at the small brown bag still in his hand. From it, he pulled the torn marine pin, held it in the light for a moment, and then placed it gently on the podium. He said only 6 words, "Legacy isn't what we take credit for." Then he stepped back. Whitaker nodded once, visibly moved. He returned to the microphone. "If this academy stands for anything," he said, "it stands because men like Sergeant Reed built it without ever needing to be thanked." And then, turning back to Jonathan, Whitaker smiled. "But it's about damn time we did." The applause didn't erupt. It rose slow, reverent, like rain on still water. The kind of applause that doesn't celebrate fame, but finally recognizes sacrifice. For a long moment, no one moved. The final word still hung in the air, "Legacy isn't what we take credit for." Slowly, a wave of motion passed through the crowd. First one cadet stood, then another, and then 3 more. Soon, the entire courtyard, officers, students, veterans, and officials, rose silently to their feet. And then the applause came. It wasn't the thunderous kind meant for spectacle. It was deliberate, steady. Each clap was a wordless offering of gratitude, like a nation nodding its head all at once. At the front, Admiral Whitaker stood a step behind Jonathan. Not beside him. It was a subtle shift, but a meaningful one, a kind of difference, as if to say, "This moment belongs to him, not me." In the second row, the young lieutenant who had earlier redirected Jonathan away from his rightful seat lowered his eyes. He didn't clap at first. He just stared at the old man now standing under the bright midday sun and quietly shook his head at himself. A few seats over, another officer murmured. "That's the man I asked to move." Jonathan Reed, for his part, didn't look around. He didn't scan the crowd. He didn't bask in the recognition. He simply stepped forward to the podium when Whitaker offered it again, adjusted the mic slightly, and spoke in a voice both gentle and steady. "I didn't come here to be called forward," he began. "I didn't come to give a speech or wear a title or relive anything." His eyes lifted slowly, locking with no one in particular, and yet, it seemed, with everyone at once. "I came to remember 3 names. They're written right here on this piece of paper." He reached into his shirt pocket and unfolded a small, creased square. "I was 27 when I trained the first class at Clearwater. I wasn't a teacher. I wasn't even ready for civilian life. He paused, his voice catching for the first time. These 3 names, they were cadets in that first class. Smart, brave, they gave everything before the world ever got a chance to know their faces. That's why I came back today. Not for the applause. Not for a ceremony. He lowered the paper, folded it again with care, and tucked it back into his pocket. I came because some things are only remembered if someone is willing to keep remembering. And that was it. No final flourish. No rallying cry. He stepped down and returned to the row where he had first been asked to leave. But this time, there was no confusion. Every officer who had once doubted him now rose instinctively to let him pass. One even held out a chair for him and didn't sit until Jonathan had. The ceremony continued. Of course, awards were given, speeches delivered. The brass band played its final patriotic refrain. But something in the air had shifted, from the highest-ranking general to the youngest cadet. Every attendee now carried the awareness that legacy isn't only written in metal and stone. Sometimes it's written in silence, in footsteps taken without announcement, in years of service never documented in official archives, but etched quietly into the people and places left behind. Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the chairs had been folded away, Jonathan stayed behind a little longer. He walked the campus slowly, recognizing certain bricks, certain beams. Buildings had changed, trees had grown. But beneath it all, he still felt the same bones of the same foundation he had helped lay so many years before. He stopped at the base of the statue near the old training field. It wasn't large, maybe 5 feet tall, cast in bronze, but it wasn't the usual kind of tribute either. It didn't show him in uniform, didn't show him young or proud or decorated. Instead, it showed a weathered man, shoulders slightly stooped, sleeves rolled up, holding a worn field notebook in one hand and standing just behind a group of cadets, mid-training, observing, supporting, not leading, just present. At the base of the statue, a single plaque read, "Not all heroes speak. Some just build." Jonathan said nothing. He simply touched the brim of his old cap and walked away, disappearing down the path that led toward the academy gates. 1 year later, Clearwater Academy unveiled its newest training facility, Reed Hall, a state-of-the-art tactical building complete with simulators, briefing rooms, and combat readiness environments designed to prepare cadets not just for war, but for responsibility, resilience, and restraint. Jonathan was invited to the ribbon cutting, but he never came. When asked why, he wrote a letter. It read, "Buildings don't matter unless people inside them remember why they exist. I'd rather be remembered by how you train, not how you clap." That letter is now framed in the main hall of the building. Beneath it, cadets walk past every day, some pausing to read, others unaware entirely. But a few, those who listen closely, understand. They straighten their backs, hold the door a little longer for the man behind them, write just a little neater in their field books. Because legacy isn't loud. Sometimes, it walks quietly to the back of the room and still shapes everything. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way. Often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Heartfelt Gratitude Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.